The first thing I remember was the sound of beeping. Just a low, steady beat, filling a silence so deep, it felt like I was trapped beneath layers of darkness. I tried to open my eyes, but it felt impossible, like lifting weights far too heavy for me to carry. My mind was blurry, and I couldn't piece together where I was or why. Then I heard voices, faint but clear, and I clung to them, letting their sound pull me up from whatever dark place I'd been stuck in. A nurse spoke gently to me, telling me that I was safe, that everything would be okay. It sounded so soothing, so kind, but her words made no sense. Safe? I didn't feel safe. I felt lost, completely detached from everything I'd ever known. It was when I finally managed to open my eyes that reality began to hit. The room was sterile, bright lights overhead, walls painted the cold shade of a hospital ward. Machines surrounded me, tubes and wires attached to my body like chains. I tried to speak, but my voice was a rough, broken whisper, barely audible. The nurse smiled gently, her face blurred, but her voice came through. Gentle, yet you've been through a lot. You were in an accident. Do you remember that? I shook my head slightly, confusion swirling as I struggled to understand what was happening. An accident? I didn't remember anything. Not the accident, not the hospital, not even the days before. All I knew was this room, this bed, and the empty silence around me. You've been in a coma, the nurse continued, her tone soft as if bracing me for what she'd say next. For 6 months. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. 6 months. Half a year of my life. Gone, slipped away while I lay there, unaware, suspended between life and something else. I searched her face, trying to make sense of it, but all I could manage was a weak whisper. Where is my family? The nurse's face softened with sympathy, and that look made my stomach drop. She didn't answer right away, and the silence stretched on, heavy and unyielding. Then she simply said, "They're not here right now." I could tell she was choosing her words carefully, trying not to shatter whatever fragile hope I was clinging to. But her hesitation spoke volumes. They weren't here. Not now. Not yesterday. They hadn't been there when I'd opened my eyes after 6 months lost in darkness. The emptiness settled over me, cold and suffocating. I tried to ignore it, to brush it aside as exhaustion, as shock. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was alone. The people I'd spent my life caring about, sacrificing for, weren't here. And that silence was louder than any answer the nurse could have given me. The days blended together, each one filled with doctors and nurses coming and going, running tests, checking monitors, adjusting medications. They were kind, always smiling, always trying to keep me comfortable, but their warmth only made the absence of my family more stark, more painful. I would listen to their footsteps echo down the hall, hoping each time that I'd see a familiar face, hear a familiar voice, but the door stayed closed. Every time I asked where my family was, the nurses offered the same practiced sympathy, the same hesitant answers. "They're not here right now. I'm sure they'll visit soon. They're probably just busy." But days passed, then weeks, and I was left waiting in an empty hospital room. No messages, no visits, nothing but a silence that grew heavier with each passing day. It hurt more than the injuries that had left me in that bed, more than the frustration of relearning how to move, how to speak clearly. This ache was different, sharper, a reminder that, somewhere along the way, I'd become someone who could be forgotten. As I lay there, forced to confront the silence, memories started surfacing. Moments from before the accident, fragments that began to reveal a story I'd spent too long ignoring. I started to remember the way things had been, the life I'd been living before all of this. My family had always been distant, even then. It hadn't been obvious at first, not when I was a kid, but as I grew older, the patterns became clear. I was the one who gave, who cared, who made myself small to fit into the spaces they allowed. Birthdays, holidays, they were more like afterthoughts. My achievements, my efforts, they all faded into the background, outshined by the needs and dramas of everyone else. There was my younger sister, Sophie. She'd always had a knack for finding herself in trouble, one crisis after another, each one demanding attention, focus. I can still remember the countless times I dropped everything to help her, to clean up her messes, to make sure she was okay. It became an unspoken rule in the family that Sophie's needs came first, that we all revolved around her, accommodating her every demand. And I'd accepted it, had told myself that this was just what family did. I'd convinced myself that sacrificing was my role. And then there was my mother, always doting on Sophie, always telling me how strong I was, how independent. I'd been so proud of that once, had thought it was a compliment. But now, lying there in that sterile hospital room, I started to understand what she'd really meant. Independent. It was her way of saying I could manage on my own, that I didn't need her, that I wasn't worth the same attention, the same care that she gave so freely to Sophie. It became clearer with each passing day, the moments piecing together like shards of broken glass. There had been a time before the accident when I'd called my parents, just to tell them about a small promotion I'd earned at work. I'd been excited, hoping they'd share in my happiness, that they'd be proud. But the conversation had quickly shifted, overtaken by yet another one of Sophie's latest mishaps. My promotion had barely earned a few words before my mother's voice had grown hurried, distracted, brushing me off with a quick, "I'll call you back, sweetheart." But the call had never come. And now, as I lay in this hospital bed, the truth of it all weighed down on me. Each memory a sharp, painful reminder of how invisible I'd become to them. They hadn't called back then, and they hadn't come now, when I'd needed them the most. A part of me still clung to hope, whispering that they'd come eventually, that something must be holding them back. But as more days slipped by, that hope began to feel like a lie I was telling myself, a story to fill the emptiness. Because if I faced the truth, if I really accepted that they'd moved on, that they'd chosen to live without me, then I'd have to confront a loneliness that stretched deeper than any wound. One morning, a nurse named Sarah came into my room with a sympathetic smile, bringing the familiar warmth that had become my only comfort. She adjusted my blanket, her hands gentle, her voice soft as she asked, "How are you feeling today?" I tried to smile, to answer with something positive, something hopeful. But the truth slipped out instead, my voice weak yet raw. "Why? Aren't they here, Sarah? Why hasn't anyone come?" Sarah paused, a flicker of sadness crossing her face as she took a seat beside my bed. She didn't offer the usual reassurances, didn't give me the practiced lines I'd grown used to. Instead, she looked at me, truly looked at me, her eyes filled with a kindness that somehow made the truth feel less brutal. "Sometimes, people don't know how to handle situations like this," she said gently. "It's not fair, and it's not right, but some people struggle to stay when things get difficult." Her words were soft, but they struck a chord deep within me. I understood what she meant, even if I didn't want to. My family had always been this way, unreliable, detached, there when things were easy, but nowhere to be found when I needed them most. And now, faced with the reality of my condition, they'd chosen to look away, to keep living as if I'd never existed. I nodded slowly, swallowing back the tears that threatened to fall. "Thank you, Sarah. I guess I needed to hear that." As she left the room, a hollow acceptance settled over me, mixing with a simmering anger that I couldn't ignore. I had spent my whole life giving, sacrificing, putting everyone else's needs above my own. I had played the role of the independent one, the strong one, the one who didn't need help. And this was where it had gotten me, alone in a hospital room, forgotten by the very people I'd devoted myself to. For the first time, I let myself feel the weight of that truth, allowed myself to acknowledge the bitterness, the betrayal. It was a turning point, a shift I hadn't expected. Because as the anger rose within me, so did a quiet resolve. If they could move on, if they could live without me, then maybe, just maybe, I could do the same. Over the next few weeks, the anger that had sparked within me didn't fade. Instead, it grew, sharpening into a determination I hadn't known I was capable of. Every day that passed without a single visit, without a single message from the people I had once called family, solidified one thing. I couldn't keep waiting for them. Yet even as I told myself to let go, I found myself fighting against the loneliness. Nights were the hardest. When the hospital ward grew quiet and the low hum of machines was the only sound in the room, I would lie awake, memories filling the darkness around me. Memories of birthdays where I sat in the corner, forgotten as my family celebrated Sophie's achievements. Memories of holiday dinners where my voice was drowned out by everyone else's needs. Every memory stung, but they all carried the same unspoken message. I had never truly mattered. I thought back to my childhood, to the moments when I'd wait at the dinner table, eager to share my day, only to be met with distracted nods, quick glances, and the constant interruptions of my family's more important issues. I had once convinced myself that love looked like this: quiet, unacknowledged, hidden beneath layers of independence they'd always said I had. But now, lying in that bed, I finally understood what had been clear all along. They had left me out, and I'd grown up accepting scraps as if they were the whole meal. The physical therapy sessions started soon after, and I poured everything into them. It was painful. Each step, each movement, like fire in my limbs, a relentless reminder of the damage the accident had left behind. But that pain, that struggle, it was something I could control, something I could focus on, and each step I took was a step away from the memories that haunted me. One afternoon, as I was gripping the parallel bars in the therapy room, my muscles trembling under the strain, I overheard two nurses talking. They didn't see me, absorbed in their conversation as they walked by. "Did you hear about the patient in room 112? One of them whispered, casting a quick glance my way. "Her family hasn't visited her at all. Can you imagine? Just left her like that." "People can be so cold," the other replied, her tone tinged with disbelief. 6 months in a coma, and they act like she never existed. It's heartbreaking. They moved on, their voices fading as they turned the corner, but their words hung in the air, filling me with a sense of vulnerability I hadn't expected. It was one thing to know that I'd been abandoned. It was another to realize that others could see it too, that my invisibility to my family was now something painfully public. Back in my room, I stared at my reflection in the mirror beside my bed. I looked different now, thinner, paler, a stranger in my own skin. I didn't recognize the person looking back at me, and in that moment, I felt the depth of my isolation like a physical weight. I was starting over, yes, but I was doing it alone, rebuilding myself from the ground up with no one there to see the journey. A few days later, the social worker assigned to my case paid me a visit, her demeanor warm, yet professional. She sat beside my bed, her clipboard balanced on her lap, and gave me a soft smile that seemed to convey both understanding and pity. "Hi, I'm Maria," she introduced herself. "I'm here to make sure you have the resources you need as you prepare for your recovery and transition out of the hospital." I nodded, feeling the familiar ache rise in my chest. Transitioning out of the hospital, a phrase that should have been filled with hope, now felt hollow, empty, because I had nowhere to go. "Thank you, Maria," I replied, my voice steady but quiet, "but there's no one waiting for me out there. No one to help." She studied me for a moment, sympathy clear in her eyes, but she didn't patronize me. "I understand. This happens more often than you'd think. Sometimes, people find themselves in situations where their support system fails them." That phrase, "support system fails," struck a nerve. I hadn't just been failed, I'd been abandoned, left behind by the very people I had trusted, the ones I thought would be there in my darkest moments. But Maria's words also carried a strange comfort, an acknowledgement that what I was going through was real, that it wasn't something I was imagining. "If you're open to it," Maria continued gently, "we can help connect you with a support group, people who've been through similar situations. It won't replace your family, but it might help to talk with others who understand what it feels like to rebuild, even when you're doing it alone." For the first time, the idea of letting others into my world didn't feel as frightening. I realized I needed to be heard, to share my story with someone who wouldn't judge, who wouldn't treat my pain like an inconvenience. Maybe opening up to people who had faced their own struggles would help me find a way forward. "Thank you, Maria," I said softly, feeling a glimmer of hope amidst the pain. I think I'd like that." The rest of that day passed in a blur of thought. For the first time since I'd woken up in that hospital bed, I felt like I had a choice to stop waiting, to stop hoping for people who had made their decision to live without me. I could either stay in this limbo, haunted by memories of people who had chosen their lives over mine, or I could start to build a new life, a life that didn't depend on their approval, their presence, or their love. It wasn't an easy decision. There were years, decades even, of conditioning to overcome, years of believing that my worth was tied to the family that had left me behind. But I knew now that they weren't coming back. that they had found a way to move on without me. And if they could do it, then maybe, just maybe, I could too. That night, as I lay in the quiet darkness of my hospital room, I whispered a quiet promise to myself. "You're gonna make it through this," I told the person I saw in the mirror. The stranger who was slowly becoming a part of me. You don't need them to find happiness. You don't need them to be whole. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe those words, to feel their power settle within me. I wasn't sure where this journey would take me, or how many more painful memories I'd have to face. But I knew that whatever lay ahead, I would face it with strength. The day I was finally discharged from the hospital, it was raining. I watched the drops hit the windows, blurring the city beyond, each drop a reminder that I was stepping out alone, stepping back into a world that had moved on without me. I clutched the small bag of belongings I'd managed to accumulate, glancing around at the empty hallway one last time. This was it, the start of something new. There was no homecoming celebration, no waiting car, no one to hold my hand, just me, standing at the hospital entrance, watching the rain fall. I took a shaky breath, telling myself that this was freedom, that walking out alone meant I was finally free from the expectations and obligations that had once bound me. But despite the freedom, there was still an ache, a hollow emptiness that had followed me since the moment I'd woken up in that hospital bed. As I started down the steps, a voice called out behind me. "Wait, you forgot something." I turned to see Sarah, the nurse who had been so kind to me, jogging over with a small envelope in her hand. She pressed it into my palm, her expression soft. "This came for you this morning. I thought you'd want to have it." Surprised, I looked down at the envelope, the familiar handwriting catching my eye. It was from my mother. My heart clenched as I hesitated, wondering what could possibly be inside. But I thanked Sarah and slipped the envelope into my pocket, too afraid to open it right there in the open air, where the world could see my vulnerability. Later, as I sat in the small, temporary apartment I'd managed to rent, I stared at the envelope, my fingers trembling as I tore it open. Inside was a letter, the words scrawled in my mother's handwriting, rushed and uneven. "I hope you're well. We heard about your accident, but we didn't know how to reach you. Things have been busy and Sophie's been having a hard time adjusting. I thought you'd understand. I knew you'd pull through because you're strong, and you've always managed on your own. We're here if you need anything, but I understand if you'd rather be on your own. Take care." The letter fell from my hands, landing in my lap as I stared at the words. Numb. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the pain they'd caused, no attempt to make amends. Just the same, tired excuse I'd heard all my life. "I thought you'd understand." As if my strength made me somehow less deserving of love, of care, of a family that would stand by me in my weakest moments. I felt a surge of anger rise within me, stronger than anything I'd felt before. This was the catalyst, the final straw that shattered the illusion I'd held on to, the idea that maybe, someday, they would see me, appreciate me, love me the way I'd always loved them. But that letter was a reminder that they would never change, that they would continue living their lives, content to let me stand on the sidelines, forgotten and alone. And in that moment, I made a choice. I would no longer wait for them to change. I would no longer keep a place in my heart for people who couldn't be bothered to show up, to support me when I needed it most. I would rebuild my life, piece by piece, without them. The anger turned to determination, a fierce resolve that filled the hollow spaces they'd left behind. I would become my own support system, my own family. I didn't need them to survive. I had proven that to myself already. And now I was going to prove that I could thrive, that I could build a life filled with people who cared, who valued me, who saw me as more than a footnote in their story. With that decision made, I felt a weight lift, a sense of clarity I hadn't known in years. It was time to stop holding on to the past, to stop letting their indifference define my worth. I was ready to let go, to move forward, to find my own path, my own happiness. In the days that followed, the decision I'd made in that quiet apartment became a fire inside me, pushing me forward. I threw myself into creating a life of my own, one that didn't revolve around waiting for scraps of attention or holding on to empty promises. The The support group Maria had introduced me to became my lifeline, a place where I could speak freely, where I wasn't invisible, where I was seen for who I was, not who I could be for someone else. It was in one of those support group meetings that I met Claire, a woman who'd survived her own storm, one that had left her reeling and alone, just as I had been. Her friendship became a source of strength I hadn't realized I needed. We'd meet up for coffee after meetings, talk about the lives we were building from the ground up. She became my confidant, the one who'd laugh with me, cry with me, and remind me that I was worth more than the life I'd left behind. And it was with Claire's encouragement that I decided to confront my past directly. One evening, I found myself dialing my mother's number, my hands trembling as I waited for her to pick up. I hadn't called since I'd read that letter, hadn't reached out since I'd decided to let go of the fantasy I'd clung to all my life. But I knew I couldn't fully move on without facing them, without saying the words that had been building inside me since the day I'd woken up alone in that hospital bed. When she answered, her voice sounded the same as it always had, brisk, polite, almost as if she'd been expecting a call from someone she barely knew. "Hello?" "Hi, Mom," I said, my voice steady despite the swirl of emotions rising within me. "It's me. I wanted to talk." There was a pause, a brief hesitation that spoke louder than any words. "Oh, hello, dear. It's been a while. How have you been?" Her voice was distant, casual, as if we were old friends catching up, as if she hadn't left me to face my darkest moments alone. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. I wanted to talk about what happened, about the accident and everything that came after. Another pause, longer this time. "I see," she replied, her tone cautious. "Well, we were all very busy. Life doesn't stop, you understand. Sophie had a lot going on, and your father and I... Stop." My voice came out stronger than I'd intended, but I didn't back down. "Mom, I'm not calling to hear excuses. I'm calling because I need you to understand how much it hurt, being forgotten like that, being treated like I didn't matter. You've always expected me to understand, to accept that you'd be there for Sophie, for everyone else. But when it was me lying there, you couldn't even bother to show up." Silence filled the line, a heavy, tense silence that felt like the culmination of years of unspoken pain. "I don't know what you want me to say," she finally replied, her voice wavering slightly. "You've always been so strong, so capable. I thought you'd manage. I thought—" "That's exactly it," I interrupted, the words spilling out, each one a release of years of pent-up emotion. "You've always thought I didn't need anything, didn't need you. But I did. And I can't keep pretending that it's okay, that your neglect doesn't matter. I can't keep sacrificing my own happiness, my own worth, to fit into a role that's convenient for you." There was a stunned silence on her end, the weight of my words sinking in. I could almost picture her sitting there, shocked that the person she'd always overlooked was finally speaking up, finally demanding to be heard. "I want you to know," I continued, my voice softer now but filled with resolve, "that I'm done waiting for you to change. I'm done holding on to the idea that you'll suddenly see me, appreciate me. I'm moving on, and I'm doing it without you." A shaky breath escaped her, and I thought I heard a hint of remorse in her voice, but I didn't wait for an apology that might never come. I ended the call, feeling a strange, surreal calm wash over me. I had said what I needed to say, had finally spoken the words that had been trapped inside me for so long. I was no longer tied to the past, no longer bound by the invisible chains that had kept me waiting, hoping, hurting. In that moment, I realized I'd freed myself. I'd taken the first step into a life that belonged entirely to me. A life where I no longer had to seek validation or acceptance from people who could only see me as a shadow. I was done with shadows. It was time to live fully, boldly, and unapologetically. As I stood there in my small apartment, looking out at the city lights flickering in the distance, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. This was my beginning, my chance to rebuild on my terms. And though the journey would be long, filled with challenges I couldn't yet see, I knew I would face them with the strength I'd found within myself, the strength that had carried me through the darkest days. With a steady breath, I whispered a quiet promise to myself. I am enough, just as I am, and I will make a life that reflects that. The days after that call were a strange mix of relief and raw emotion. I felt as if I'd shed a heavy weight, a burden I'd carried for so long I'd forgotten what it was like to stand up straight. Confronting my mother hadn't healed the scars, but it had given me something precious: closure. For the first time, I wasn't holding on to the past, hoping for a love that would never come. I was free to build a life on my own terms, a life that didn't rely on anyone else's approval or acceptance. With a sense of clarity, I started to focus on the things that mattered to me, things I'd never given myself the space to explore before. I threw myself into my physical recovery, each session of therapy a testament to my resilience, my strength. The doctors had warned me that progress would be slow, that I might never regain full function in certain areas. But I welcomed every challenge, each small victory a reminder that I was reclaiming my life, bit by bit. Claire was by my side through it all, cheering me on, reminding me that I didn't have to face the journey alone. And soon, my little circle began to grow. Through the support group, I met others who'd survived their own storms. Each of us scarred but stronger. Each of us fighting for a fresh start. It was in their company that I found a kind of family, one that was built on understanding, on the shared resilience of people who had chosen to keep moving forward. One evening, as I sat with Claire at our favorite cafe, a sense of contentment settled over me. We'd spent hours laughing, swapping stories, and talking about our plans for the future. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt genuinely happy, at peace with the life I was building, the person I was becoming. "I'm proud of you, you know," Claire said, her voice soft but sincere. "You've come so far, and I can see it. You're stronger now, more than ever." I looked at her, a smile tugging at my lips. "I think I finally believe that," I replied, feeling the truth of my words settle within me. "It's strange, isn't it? How you can lose so much and still end up with more than you started with." She nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "Sometimes the hardest things show us what really matters. And you're building something beautiful." As we parted ways that night, I felt a quiet sense of accomplishment, a realization that I had done what I once thought impossible. I had found a way to be whole, to be content, without the people I'd once thought were my only source of love. My family hadn't been there for me, but in their absence I had learned to be there for myself, to give myself the love and support I had spent years seeking from others. That night, alone in my apartment, I took out a journal, something I'd started keeping as part of my therapy. I flipped to a blank page and began to write, each word a reflection of the journey I'd traveled, the transformation I'd undergone. Today I am not the person I was before. I am stronger, more resilient. I have learned that my worth is not defined by the people who stay or leave, but by the strength I find within myself. I am free from the chains of my past, and I am ready to embrace a future that belongs entirely to me. With each line, I felt a sense of closure, a final release from the hurt and the abandonment that had once defined me. I was no longer a victim of my circumstances. I was a survivor, a fighter, a person who had found her way back to herself. As I closed the journal, I looked around my little apartment, the place that had become my sanctuary, my symbol of independence. And for the first time, I saw it not as a temporary refuge, but as the beginning of my new life. A life I'd built with my own hands, my own courage. In the days that followed, I continued to grow, to rebuild, to surround myself with people who valued me for who I was. The pain of my family's absence still lingered, a scar that would always be a part of me, but it no longer controlled me, no longer defined my worth. I was free, and that freedom was worth every struggle, every tear, every moment of loneliness. Standing by the window one morning, watching the sun rise over the city, I felt a quiet joy, a sense of belonging that came not from others but from within. I was home, not because of a place or a person, but because I had finally found my way back to myself. And in that moment, I knew I would be okay. Whatever the future held, I was ready for it, stronger than ever, ready to face it with an open heart and an unbreakable spirit.